The Helsinki Accords emerged not from triumph or crisis, but from exhaustion, calculation, and the recognition that the Cold War in Europe had reached a dangerous stalemate. Because by the late 1960s, the continent was frozen into a rigid division that neither side could overturn without catastrophic risk. Yet both sides remained deeply insecure about the permanence of that division, creating pressure for a framework that could stabilize borders without resolving the ideological conflict beneath them. After 2 decades of confrontation, military alliances had solidified, nuclear weapons had multiplied, and repeated crises had demonstrated that escalation could spin out of control with alarming speed, leading policymakers on both sides of the Iron Curtain to conclude that survival required predictability more than victory. For the Soviet Union, the primary objective was legitimacy, as post-war borders in Eastern Europe, created through force and cemented after World War II, remained politically fragile and morally contested, particularly by West Germany and its allies, leaving Moscow determined to secure formal Western recognition of the territorial status quo. This desire was driven not only by fear of military revisionism, but by internal insecurity, as the Soviet leadership understood that its authority over Eastern Europe rested on coercion rather than consent, making any challenge to borders a potential catalyst for unrest within the bloc. For Western Europe, particularly after the trauma of Berlin, crises, and the realization that nuclear war would be fought on European soil, the priority was stability and communication, the creation of mechanisms that could reduce misunderstanding, manage confrontation, and prevent local incidents from spiraling into superpower catastrophe. These overlapping but fundamentally different goals converged in the concept of détente, a strategy that sought not to end the Cold War, but to regulate it, replacing permanent crisis with managed rivalry. The idea of a pan-European security conference had circulated since the 1950s, but it was only in the late 1960s, as the costs of confrontation mounted and the limits of force became undeniable, that momentum built behind a comprehensive diplomatic initiative. Finland, positioned geographically and politically between East and West, offered itself as neutral ground, symbolizing the possibility of dialogue without alignment and providing a venue that reassured both blocs. The negotiations that followed were long, complex, and deeply mistrustful, because every clause carried strategic implications and every concession risked being interpreted as weakness, forcing diplomats to balance reassurance with ambiguity at every step. The resulting process, known as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, unfolded over years rather than months, reflecting the depth of suspicion that still defined relations between the blocs. At its core, the Helsinki process sought to address 3 intertwined dimensions of European security, military stability, economic and scientific cooperation, and human contacts. Yet agreement on these dimensions required carefully crafted language that allowed each side to claim success without surrendering core principles. The Soviet Union focused intensely on securing recognition of existing borders and the principle of non-intervention, viewing these as shields against external interference and internal dissent, while Western states insisted on the inclusion of commitments to human rights, freedom of movement, and information, seeing these as moral imperatives and long-term instruments of change. This tension defined the negotiations, as neither side trusted the other's intentions, and each sought to embed its priorities in language flexible enough to be interpreted favorably at home. The resulting document was deliberately ambiguous, combining firm declarations with non-binding commitments, a structure that reflected the Cold War's preference for managing risk rather than resolving contradictions. When the Helsinki Final Act was signed in 1975, it did not create new laws or enforceable mechanisms, yet its symbolic weight was immense because it represented the first time since the early Cold War that the entire European security order had been discussed and codified in a single forum involving both superpowers and nearly all European states. Publicly, leaders framed the Accords as a triumph of peace and cooperation, yet privately, many understood that their true significance lay not in immediate change, but in the framework they established for future pressure, dialogue, and contestation. Critics in the West accused their governments of legitimizing Soviet domination of Eastern Europe by recognizing post-war borders, while skeptics in the East feared that commitments to human rights would open the door to subversion and unrest, revealing how deeply the Accords unsettled assumptions on both sides. This unease reflected the paradox at the heart of Helsinki, that by attempting to freeze the Cold War order, the Accords also introduced principles that would gradually erode it, embedding norms that challenged the legitimacy of repression, even as they affirmed territorial stability. The Act's language on sovereignty and human dignity coexisted uneasily, creating a contradiction that neither side could fully control, and it was this contradiction that would ultimately give the Helsinki Accords their enduring power. At the moment of signing, however, the future consequences were far from clear, as the Cold War remained intact, alliances remained armed, and distrust remained profound, leaving the Accords suspended between symbolism and substance, their true impact deferred to a future shaped by how states and societies would choose to interpret and invoke them. The Helsinki Accords thus began not as a turning point, but as a calculated gamble by both blocs, a wager that formalizing coexistence could reduce risk without undermining control, and that words, carefully chosen and cautiously endorsed, might succeed where force had failed in stabilizing a divided continent. As the ink dried on the Helsinki Final Act, its practical meaning remained deliberately uncertain, because the document had been designed not as a treaty with enforcement mechanisms, but as a political commitment whose power would depend entirely on interpretation, invocation, and pressure over time, reflecting a Cold War logic in which ambiguity was preferable to confrontation and gradual erosion, more effective than direct challenge. For the Soviet Union and its allies, the Accords were immediately framed as a diplomatic victory, celebrated as formal Western acceptance of Europe's post-war borders and the legitimacy of existing regimes, a narrative that reassured party elites and reinforced the claim that socialism in Eastern Europe was now internationally recognized and secure. This framing was essential domestically because it allowed Soviet leaders to present détente not as compromise, but as consolidation, a strategy that preserved control while reducing the risk of war and alleviating economic strain through increased contact with the West. Western governments, by contrast, emphasized a different reading, highlighting the human rights provisions as the true achievement of Helsinki, and portraying the recognition of borders as a pragmatic acknowledgement of reality rather than an endorsement of repression, arguing that stability was a prerequisite for change, and that norms, once codified, could become instruments of long-term pressure. This dual interpretation was not an accident, but the product of negotiation. As both sides accepted language they believed they could manage, underestimating how the document would be used beyond official channels. The most consequential feature of the Accords lay in their commitment to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and movement, principles that had existed in international declarations but had never before been acknowledged collectively by the entire Eastern Bloc in a European security framework. Although these commitments were explicitly non-binding, their inclusion created a reference point that activists, dissidents, and ordinary citizens could invoke, transforming abstract ideals into tangible obligations that governments had publicly accepted. This transformation was gradual and initially underestimated because state leaders assumed that non-binding language and control over media would prevent widespread mobilization around these principles, a miscalculation that revealed how norms can acquire power through repetition and legitimacy rather than enforcement. In Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the Helsinki Accords provided dissidents with a new vocabulary of resistance, one that framed demands not as revolutionary challenges but as appeals to promises already made, a shift that reduced the space for authorities to dismiss criticism as foreign agitation or treason. Monitoring groups emerged to document violations of Helsinki commitments, turning the act into a living document rather than a static declaration and forcing regimes to confront their own words in international forums. This development exposed a fundamental contradiction in the Soviet approach to détente, because while leaders sought recognition and stability, they had accepted language that undermined the ideological justification for repression and legitimized scrutiny from within and without. Western governments, initially cautious about provoking backlash, gradually incorporated Helsinki principles into diplomacy, using them to press for greater openness and to justify engagement with civil society behind the Iron Curtain, a strategy that aligned moral pressure with strategic patience. This approach reflected a broader evolution in Cold War practice, as influence increasingly flowed through norms, information, and legitimacy rather than solely through military power, challenging assumptions about how change could occur in closed societies. Yet the immediate impact of Helsinki should not be overstated, because repression did not end, borders did not shift, and the Cold War did not dissolve, illustrating how the Accords functioned less as a catalyst for rapid transformation than as a slow-acting solvent, eroding foundations over time. Skepticism persisted on both sides, with critics arguing that the Accords either conceded too much or promised too little, and that words without enforcement were meaningless in the face of tanks and prisons. Nevertheless, the very act of codifying principles created expectations that could not be entirely controlled, because once norms are articulated, they shape perceptions of legitimacy and injustice even when violated. The Helsinki process institutionalized dialogue through follow-up, meetings, and review conferences, ensuring that commitments would be revisited rather than forgotten, and embedding human rights into the ongoing agenda of East-West relations. This institutionalization mattered because it normalized discussion of internal practices as legitimate subjects of international concern, challenging the doctrine of absolute sovereignty that had shielded repression. Over time, the persistence of this dialogue altered the tone of European security, shifting it from episodic crisis to continuous negotiation and creating channels through which pressure, embarrassment, and persuasion could operate. The Helsinki Accords thus began to reveal their deeper significance, not as an endpoint, but as a process, one that bound states into a web of expectations and scrutiny that slowly constrained behavior, even as power remained uneven. In this way, the Accords demonstrated how the Cold War could be shaped by commitments that lacked force, yet carried weight, illustrating that in a nuclear age, stability and change might emerge not from decisive victories, but from the cumulative effect of words repeatedly invoked against the realities they described. As the Helsinki process continued into the late 1970s and early 1980s, its unintended consequences became increasingly visible, because what had begun as a diplomatic mechanism to stabilize borders and manage rivalry gradually evolved into a platform that exposed the moral and political fragility of authoritarian rule in Eastern Europe, revealing how norms, once articulated and acknowledged, could acquire a force independent of the power structures that sought to contain them. Dissident movements across the Eastern Bloc drew explicitly on Helsinki language to legitimize their demands, framing their actions not as opposition to socialism or alignment with the West, but as efforts to hold governments accountable to commitments they had voluntarily endorsed, a strategy that proved difficult to counter without admitting hypocrisy or retreating from international engagement. Groups documenting violations multiplied, linking local grievances to international scrutiny, and transforming repression from a domestic matter into a source of diplomatic embarrassment, a development that altered the cost-benefit calculations of regimes accustomed to operating behind the shield of sovereignty. This shift was subtle but profound, because it did not immediately weaken state power. Yet it undermined the narrative that authority was unchallengeable and that dissent was illegitimate, introducing doubt into systems that depended on ideological certainty. Western governments increasingly leveraged this dynamic, integrating Helsinki commitments into bilateral relations and multilateral forums, using review conferences to raise specific cases and to press for incremental change, a strategy that allowed moral pressure to be applied without abandoning détente or provoking direct confrontation. This approach reflected a growing confidence that engagement, rather than isolation, could erode authoritarian control by exposing contradictions and amplifying internal voices, challenging earlier assumptions that security required silence on internal repression. The Soviet leadership found itself caught between competing imperatives because retreat from Helsinki would undermine the legitimacy and stability it had sought. Yet, full compliance threatened to loosen control and embolden dissent, forcing a balancing act that grew more precarious as economic stagnation and generational change weakened ideological cohesion. Attempts to manage the fallout through selective repression and rhetorical commitment revealed the limits of control, as each crackdown confirmed the very violations Helsinki had made visible, reinforcing cycles of criticism and resistance. Within the Warsaw Pact, differences in how regimes responded to Helsinki commitments exposed fractures in the bloc, as some governments experimented cautiously with limited openness while others doubled down on repression, highlighting the absence of a unified approach to managing legitimacy under international scrutiny. These divergences mattered because they demonstrated that the Cold War's ideological divide was not monolithic, and that variation within blocs could be exploited by norms and expectations that transcended borders. The Helsinki process also reshaped public discourse in the West, strengthening the link between security and human rights, and legitimizing activism that framed peace not merely as the absence of war, but as the presence of dignity and freedom, a reframing that influenced domestic politics and foreign policy debates. Critics continued to argue that Helsinki had conceded too much by recognizing borders imposed through force. Yet, over time, it became clear that the Accords had not frozen history, but had instead provided tools for contesting it, revealing that legitimacy, once questioned, can erode even seemingly stable structures. The endurance of the Helsinki framework ensured that these dynamics did not fade with changing leaders or shifting priorities, embedding expectations into institutions that outlasted the circumstances of their creation. This endurance transformed Helsinki from a diplomatic event into a process of normative pressure, one that operated slowly and unevenly, but persistently, reshaping the environment in which power was exercised. As the Cold War entered a period of renewed tension in the early 1980s, the Helsinki Accords continued to function as a reference point, reminding both sides that commitments made in the name of stability carried obligations that could not be entirely ignored. In this way, the Accords revealed a paradox of Cold War diplomacy, that efforts to manage rivalry through recognition and restraint could generate forces of change that escaped control, demonstrating that even in a system defined by power politics, ideas and norms could become agents of transformation. The Helsinki process thus began to show how the Cold War might end not through military confrontation or negotiated surrender, but through the gradual delegitimization of systems that could not reconcile their practices with the principles they had publicly accepted, a possibility that remained uncertain but increasingly visible as the decade progressed. By the mid-1980s, the Helsinki Accords had become inseparable from the broader transformation unfolding across Europe, because the principles they articulated now intersected with economic stagnation, generational change, and a growing recognition within the Soviet leadership that coercion alone could no longer sustain the system built after World War II, revealing how a document once dismissed as symbolic had become a quiet but persistent constraint on power. The rise of reform-minded leadership in Moscow altered the context in which Helsinki commitments were interpreted, as calls for openness, and restructuring reframed human rights and transparency not as external impositions, but as internal necessities, allowing the language of Helsinki to be appropriated from below and above simultaneously. This convergence amplified the Accords' impact, because norms that had once been invoked primarily by dissidents now aligned with official rhetoric, blurring the line between opposition and reform and accelerating the erosion of ideological rigidity. Within Eastern Europe, this shift reduced the effectiveness of repression, as regimes found it increasingly difficult to justify harsh measures against movements that framed their demands in terms of rights and commitments already endorsed by the state, undermining the moral authority of governments and exposing the fragility of their legitimacy. Western governments, observing these changes, increasingly treated Helsinki not as a static agreement, but as a foundation for a new European order, emphasizing dialogue, transparency, and confidence-building measures that reduce the risk of miscalculation while reinforcing expectations of accountability. The institutional mechanisms created by the Helsinki process facilitated this transition, as review meetings and monitoring structures provided forums where evolving norms could be articulated, contested, and normalized, embedding change within continuity rather than rupture. This gradualism mattered because it allowed transformation to proceed without triggering the defensive reflexes that had defined earlier Cold War crises, illustrating how stability and change could coexist when managed through shared frameworks rather than unilateral pressure. The recognition of borders, once seen as Helsinki's greatest concession, proved to be a stabilizing foundation that removed the fear of territorial revisionism and allowed political evolution to occur without the constant threat of war, demonstrating how security and reform could reinforce rather than undermine each other. As Eastern European states began to assert greater autonomy, Helsinki principles provided a common language that linked domestic reform to international legitimacy, creating incentives for compliance and dialogue rather than confrontation. The Cold War's end in Europe thus unfolded not as a sudden collapse, but as a negotiated unwinding, shaped in part by the expectations and habits cultivated through the Helsinki process, which had normalized communication and reduced the costs of compromise. The Accords' emphasis on human contacts and information exchange had also contributed to this outcome, by weakening isolation and exposing societies to alternative models, eroding the plausibility of closed systems without requiring direct intervention. In retrospect, the Helsinki Accords appear less as a peace treaty than as a framework that redefined the meaning of security, shifting it from exclusive focus on borders and military balance to include legitimacy, rights, and transparency as components of stability. This redefinition did not end conflict or eliminate inequality, but it altered the criteria by which authority was judged and challenged, making repression increasingly costly in a world where commitments were publicly articulated and internationally monitored. The success of this approach lay not in enforcement, but in persistence, as repeated invocation of norms gradually reshaped expectations and constrained behavior, illustrating how power can be influenced through legitimacy as well as coercion. The Helsinki process thus offers a rare example of how Cold War diplomacy produced change, not by defeating an adversary, but by binding it to principles that limited its own options over time. Its legacy is visible in the post-Cold War European order, where the emphasis on cooperative security, human rights, and multilateral dialogue reflects lessons learned from a process that transformed rivalry into negotiation without erasing difference. The Declassified Accords remind us that in an era defined by nuclear danger, stability was often preserved by restraint and patience rather than decisive victory, and that words, when embedded in institutions and expectations, can become forces that reshape history. The Helsinki Accords ultimately demonstrate that the Cold War's end was not inevitable, but it was made possible by choices that prioritized predictability, legitimacy, and dialogue, choices that created space for peaceful transformation in a system long defined by fear. As the Cold War drew to a close, the Helsinki Accords stood revealed as one of the quiet frameworks that had reshaped Europe, not through confrontation, but through normalization, because by embedding dialogue, transparency, and human rights into the language of security, the Accords had altered how states justified power and how societies measured legitimacy, making the continuation of rigid authoritarian control increasingly untenable without constant coercion. The collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe unfolded within an environment already conditioned by years of Helsinki-based engagement, where borders were no longer the primary source of fear and where demands for reform could be framed as fulfillment rather than rebellion, reducing the likelihood that change would trigger external intervention. This context mattered profoundly because it allowed political transitions to proceed with fewer violent ruptures than many had feared, illustrating how stability created through recognition and restraint could paradoxically enable transformation. The institutional legacy of Helsinki persisted as well, as the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe evolved into a permanent organization, reflecting the belief that security was an ongoing process rather than a fixed settlement, and that dialogue should be continuous rather than crisis-driven. This evolution demonstrated how a Cold War compromise had generated structures capable of adapting to a post-Cold War world, carrying forward lessons about transparency, confidence building, and the management of difference. Critics continued to debate whether Helsinki had delayed necessary change by legitimizing authoritarian borders, or whether it had accelerated reform by constraining repression. Yet this debate itself underscored the Accord's significance, because it acknowledged that norms and expectations had become central to how power was exercised and contested. The Accord's emphasis on human rights did not guarantee justice or equality, but it created a shared vocabulary that transcended ideological divides and allowed grievances to be articulated in ways that resonated beyond national boundaries, strengthening the link between domestic legitimacy and international standing. This link remains one of Helsinki's most enduring contributions, as it challenged the notion that sovereignty alone could shield states from scrutiny and established a precedent for treating internal practices as legitimate subjects of international concern. In this sense, the Helsinki Accords redefined the terrain of the Cold War, shifting competition from overt military confrontation to struggles over legitimacy, narrative, and compliance with publicly stated principles. This shift did not eliminate power politics, but it constrained them by introducing reputational costs and expectations that influenced behavior over time. The end of the Cold War did not render Helsinki obsolete, because the norms it promoted continued to shape European security debates, reminding states that stability depends not only on deterrence and borders, but on trust, accountability, and communication. The Accords' legacy thus lies in their demonstration that security can be constructed incrementally through engagement and expectation rather than imposed through force, a lesson that remains relevant in a world still grappling with how to manage rivalry without catastrophe. Understanding the Helsinki Accords requires recognizing them as a bridge between eras, connecting the rigid confrontations of the early Cold War with the negotiated transformations that followed, and illustrating how compromise, once institutionalized, can generate change beyond what its architects intended. The Accords did not end the Cold War by themselves, but they helped create conditions in which its end became possible without war, revealing how restraint, recognition, and norms can become instruments of profound historical change. The ultimate significance of the Helsinki Accords lies in how they exposed a fundamental truth about the Cold War, that the struggle was never sustained by military power alone, but by competing claims to legitimacy, authority, and the right to define what security meant. Because by codifying principles that linked borders, sovereignty, and human rights within a single framework, Helsinki forced both blocs to accept that stability could not be separated indefinitely from the way states treated their own societies. What made the Accords transformative was not enforcement or immediacy, but endurance. The fact that once commitments were publicly made, they could be invoked repeatedly, quietly, and relentlessly by governments, activists, and institutions long after the political moment that produced them had passed. The Cold War order in Europe did not collapse under the weight of military defeat, but under the accumulation of contradictions that Helsinki helped expose, as regimes that relied on coercion found it increasingly difficult to reconcile their practices with the principles they had formally endorsed, eroding credibility from within rather than through external attack. This erosion mattered because it shifted the terms of competition away from tanks and missiles toward narrative, compliance, and moral authority, arenas in which repression was far harder to defend and far more costly to sustain. The Accords demonstrated that recognition and restraint, often dismissed as weakness, could function as strategic tools that reduced fear while creating space for pressure that did not provoke immediate backlash, illustrating a form of power that operated through patience rather than coercion. In this sense, Helsinki revealed an alternative path within the Cold War, one in which survival and change were achieved not by escalation, but by embedding rivalry within rules, expectations, and continuous dialogue that gradually constrained behavior. The collapse of Europe's division at the end of the Cold War cannot be understood without acknowledging this framework, because it normalized negotiation, lowered the stakes of transformation, and made peaceful transition imaginable in a system long defined by the expectation of violence. The Helsinki Accords did not guarantee freedom, justice, or peace, but they altered the environment in which these goals could be pursued, binding states to words that outlived the regimes that signed them and reshaping the meaning of security in ways that extended beyond the Cold War itself. Their legacy endures as a reminder that even in an era dominated by nuclear fear and ideological rigidity, history could be changed not only by force or collapse, but by agreements that accepted imperfection, institutionalized restraint, and allowed time to do what confrontation could not, gradually transforming the landscape of power through norms that once seemed merely symbolic, but ultimately proved consequential.